If you have that baby, I'll destroy your family, the Millionaire CEO warned. But 4 years later, he saw her walking with a beautiful daughter. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr. Peter Family. May the Almighty fortify every woman with a crown of quiet courage, a shield of unshakable peace, and a river of grace that never dries. May every heartbreak transform into wisdom, every sleepless night into answered prayers, and every burden into blessings waiting to bloom. You are the flame that warms a broken world, the steady heartbeat of every home, and the silent warrior who still chooses love after pain. May your path be bright, your strength unbreakable, and your soul forever held in divine protection. My precious family, don't let your voice fade. Your presence keeps this house standing. A like is a touch of faith. A comment is a thread of unity. This is mission 1,000 likes for every woman who carries strength in her scars and hope in her heart. If love lives in you, like this video. If faith guides you, comment, I'm with Mr. Peter. There are some wounds that money cannot bandage, some betrayals that carve so deep they become the architecture of who you become. And on the night Chris Lum shoved an envelope of cash across his mahogany desk and told Zara Silver to fix her mistake, he created the woman who would one day burn his entire world to ash. Zara stood in the center of his penthouse office, her hands trembling against the silk of her dress, feeling the weight of the secret she had carried for weeks, pressing against her ribs like a stone. The city stretched below them through floor-to-ceiling windows, a glittering sprawl of lights that seemed to mock the darkness consuming the space between them. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, imagined his face softening, his arms pulling her close, the way they had on all those stolen nights when he whispered her name like a prayer against her throat. Instead, Chris stood behind his desk, with his jaw locked tight, his eyes holding the kind of cold calculation she had seen him use on rival executives before crushing their careers. The man who had traced poetry onto her skin with his fingertips had vanished, replaced by someone who looked at her like she was a problem requiring immediate elimination. She watched his hand slide across the polished wood, pushing forward a thick envelope that landed between them with the weight of finality. $50,000, he said, his voice stripped of every tender inflection she had memorized during their 6 months together. That should more than cover everything. I have the name of a discreet clinic. They can have you in and out within hours. Nobody needs to know this happened. Zara felt something crack inside her chest, a clean break that would never heal properly no matter how much time passed. She had known about Luna, had known about the engagement that Chris promised meant nothing beyond business strategy, had believed him when he said he was only marrying her for the board seats her family controlled. She had convinced herself that love mattered more than timing, that eventually he would choose authenticity over ambition. But standing there with his abortion money between them, she finally understood that she had been a convenience, something warm and willing to fill his empty hours while he built his empire on someone else's foundation. "I'm keeping the baby," she whispered, and watched his expression shift from cold dismissal to something darker, something that made her instinctively step backward. Chris moved around the desk with predatory grace, his presence filling the space until she could barely breathe. "You're not thinking clearly," he said, each word measured and precise. "Luna's family controls the board votes I need for the merger. The wedding is in 3 weeks. If you keep this child, if anyone discovers what happened between us, her family will pull their support and my company will be vulnerable to the takeover I've been fighting for 2 years. Everything I've built will collapse." "So you're asking me to choose your company over our child," Zara said, and hated how her voice broke on the last word. "I'm telling you what will happen if you don't," Chris replied, and something in his tone made her blood run cold. "Your mother works at Metropolitan General, doesn't she? Head nurse in the cardiac unit? It would be unfortunate if questions arose about her handling of medication protocols. A single investigation could cost her not just her position, but her license. And your brother's landscaping business, the one he just secured that commercial contract for, I know the developers personally. One conversation, and that contract disappears. Zara stared at him, watching the man she loved threaten her family with the casual efficiency of someone scheduling a meeting. She thought about her mother, who had worked double shifts to put her through college, who had cried with joy when Zara landed this job. She thought about her brother, who had struggled for years to build something legitimate after their father abandoned them. Chris was offering her a choice that wasn't really a choice at all, backing her into a corner with precision. "Take the money," Chris said, his hand reaching out to touch her face with gentleness that felt like mockery. "Go to the clinic. In a few months, this will all feel like a bad dream. I can't give you what you want, Zara. I can't be the man you need me to be, but I can make sure you're taken care of financially. That has to be enough." She looked at him for a long moment, memorizing the planes of his face, then picked up the envelope and nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll handle it." The relief that flooded his expression made her stomach turn, but she kept her face blank as she walked toward the door. His hand caught her wrist, pulling her back for one last kiss that tasted like goodbye and lies. "I'm sorry," he whispered against her lips. "I wish things could be different." "So do I," Zara replied, and meant it in ways he would never understand. She left his office with the envelope clutched against her chest, rode the elevator down through 40 floors of his glass tower, and walked out into night air that felt too cold. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother asking if she wanted dinner, and Zara had to lean against a street lamp to keep from collapsing. She went home to her small apartment and began packing with mechanical efficiency, her hands moving without conscious thought, folding clothes into suitcases, wrapping photographs in newspaper, taking apart the life she had built piece by piece. She booked a flight using her credit card, knowing she would max it out but not caring, knowing only that she needed to be somewhere Chris couldn't find her. Her mother would be confused, her brother would demand explanations, but Zara couldn't tell them the truth without putting them at risk. She would have to disappear so completely that Chris would have no reason to follow through on his threats. She was nearly finished packing when her apartment door shuddered under 3 sharp knocks. Zara moved to the peephole and felt her heart stop at the sight of the man standing in her hallway. She recognized him from engagement photos. Luna's older brother Dominic, tall and broad, with the kind of face that looked friendly in photographs but held something calculating around the edges. He was the architect of Luna's business strategies, the enforcer who handled problems too messy for their father's public image. He knocked again, harder, and when she didn't answer, his voice filtered through with practiced charm. "Zara Silva? I just want to talk for a moment. No need to be frightened." Every instinct screamed at her to stay silent, but before she could move away, she heard metal scraping against the lock. He was picking it, actually breaking in, and Zara stumbled backward, reaching for her phone. The door swung open, and he filled the frame, his smile never wavering. "You're making a mistake," he said conversationally, stepping inside. "My sister's wedding cannot have complications. Our family has invested considerable resources positioning Chris Lum as the ideal partner for Luna's ambitions. She's not marrying him for love, Ms. Silva. She's marrying him because his company complements ours perfectly, because together they create a dynasty that will dominate their sector for generations. You and your pregnancy represent a threat to years of careful planning." "Get out," Zara said, but her voice came out thin and terrified. "Luna knows about you," Dominic continued, his tone almost conversational. Chris's pathetic attempt at discretion fooled no one, but Luna doesn't care about his affair. She cares about timing and optics. A pregnant mistress surfacing 3 weeks before the wedding creates precisely the kind of scandal that could spook nervous board members, could make our family look weak and unprepared. So Chris gave you money, which was generous, but you're still here, still pregnant, still a problem that needs resolving. Zara tried to run for her bedroom, tried to lock herself inside, but he was faster and stronger. She fought, screamed, felt her body slam against furniture, felt pain explode through her skull when her head connected with the edge of her coffee table. The world tilted sideways, darkness creeping in, and the last thing she saw before consciousness left her was Dominic straightening his jacket like nothing had happened. When Zara woke in the hospital hours later, a kind nurse was checking her vitals. Zara said she had fallen, had been clumsy. She submitted to examination, listened to the doctor explain she had a mild concussion, felt relief when they confirmed her pregnancy was still viable. But when they left her alone in that sterile room, she made a decision that would reshape everything. She could stay and fight, or she could disappear so completely that neither Chris nor Luna's family would ever find her. She chose survival, chose her daughter's future over justice, and when she walked out of that hospital the next morning, Zara Silva ceased to exist in every way that mattered. The woman who boarded a flight that afternoon carried no name Chris Lum would recognize, nothing but his blood money and fierce determination to turn his cruelty into something he could never destroy. Chapter 2. 4 Years of Silence. Chris Lum learned to live with ghosts, though he never called them by that name, never acknowledged the way Zara's absence created a void in his days that no amount of success could fill. The merger went through exactly as planned. Luna's family delivered their board votes, and Chris found himself standing at the altar 3 weeks after Zara disappeared, watching his bride walk down an aisle decorated with white roses that cost more than most people earned in a year. Luna was beautiful in the calculated way of women who understood appearance was currency, her smile perfect for the cameras documenting their union. They signed papers that bound their companies together more thoroughly than any vows could bind their hearts, and when he kissed her in front of 500 witnesses, Chris felt nothing except the faint relief of someone who had successfully avoided disaster. The marriage settled into a rhythm of polite distance, separate bedrooms in their penthouse apartment, carefully coordinated public appearances where they played their roles with practiced ease. Luna never asked about his late nights at the office, never questioned the shadows under his eyes or the way he sometimes stood at windows, staring at nothing. She had gotten what she wanted, a powerful husband to complement her family's influence, and Chris had his board seats. It was enough, he told himself. It had to be enough. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, he thought about Zara in the fragmented way of someone trying to remember a dream. He had tried to find her in those first weeks after she disappeared, called her disconnected number, went to her apartment and found it empty with no forwarding address. Her mother claimed ignorance with tears in her eyes. Her brother had threatened to break Chris's jaw if he came around again, and eventually Chris stopped looking because what was the point? She had taken his money and solved the problem, had done exactly what he demanded, and if some small part of him wondered whether she had actually gone through with the termination, or if somewhere in the world his child existed, he buried that question under layers of work and ambition and the relentless forward momentum of building his empire. His company thrived over the next 4 years. Acquisitions and expansions that put his name in business journals, invitations to speak at conferences where younger executives hung on his every word. Luna's family opened doors that had been previously closed, their influence smoothing the path for deals that should have taken years to negotiate. On paper, Chris Lum had everything a man could want. In reality, he had built a magnificent prison and called it success. The corporate summit in the downtown convention center was the kind of event Chris usually avoided, too many boring presentations and forced networking, but Luna's father had insisted his presence would signal strength to their shareholders. Chris sat through the morning sessions with his mind elsewhere, responding to emails on his phone, barely registering the speakers who droned on about market trends and investment strategies. He was considering leaving early when the moderator introduced the afternoon keynote speaker, and something in the name made him look up from his screen. Please welcome Zara Thorne, Managing Director of Thorne Capital Ventures, who will be speaking about innovative approaches to venture funding in emerging markets. Chris felt the world narrow to a single point of focus as a woman walked onto the stage, her silhouette backlit by presentation screens, her presence commanding the kind of attention that came from genuine authority rather than borrowed influence. She was wearing a tailored suit in deep charcoal, her hair pulled back in a style that emphasized the elegant lines of her face. And when she smiled at the audience, Chris felt his heart stop and restart with painful force. It was Zara, and yet it wasn't, because the woman on that stage carried herself like someone who had never been afraid of anything, who had never stood trembling in his office accepting his threats. She spoke with the easy confidence of someone who knew her worth, her presentation dismantling traditional investment models with sharp intelligence and backing her theories with concrete data that made seasoned investors lean forward in their seats. Chris couldn't hear a word of it, his entire focus consumed by the impossible reality of her presence, the way she moved, the laugh that escaped when someone asked a particularly absurd question. She had transformed into something unreachable, something that existed in a stratosphere far above the girl he had threatened with his envelope of blood money. When the presentation ended to enthusiastic applause, Chris was already moving toward the stage, his body operating on instinct rather than thought. He needed to reach her, needed to understand how this transformation had happened, needed to hear her explain where she had been for 4 years and why she looked at him like that when their eyes met across the thinning crowd. But Zara was faster, was already being ushered backstage by conference staff, was already disappearing before he could close the distance between them. Chris followed anyway, his press credentials getting him past the first security checkpoint, his determination carrying him through the backstage corridors until he caught sight of her near the speaker's lounge. She was talking to another executive, her body language relaxed and professional, and standing beside her was a young girl, perhaps 4 years old, holding the hand of a woman who was clearly a nanny. The child had dark curls that caught the fluorescent light, a small face that held features Chris recognized from his own childhood photographs, and when she laughed at something the nanny said, the sound hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Zara must have felt his stare because her head turned sharply, her eyes locking onto his across the corridor. For a moment, everything else ceased to exist, except the weight of that gaze, the way her expression shifted from surprise to something colder than hatred, something that looked like complete indifference. She said something to her companion, touched the child's shoulder gently, and walked toward Chris with the measured stride of someone approaching an unpleasant but necessary confrontation. "Mr. Lum," she said, when she reached him, her voice professionally neutral in a way that felt worse than anger would have. "I didn't realize you would be attending this summit." Chris couldn't form words, his throat closing around all the questions that demanded answers. He looked past her at the little girl, who was now examining something in the nanny's purse, at the dark curls and the shape of her small hands, at the undeniable reality of her existence. When he finally managed to speak, his voice came out rough and unfamiliar. "You kept her." "I kept my daughter," Zara corrected, each word carefully enunciated. "She has nothing to do with you." "She has my eyes," Chris said, and watched something flicker across Zara's face before her expression locked down again into that terrible blankness. "She has her own eyes," Zara replied, "her own life, one you're not part of and never will be. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a flight to catch." She turned to leave, and Chris's hand shot out, catching her wrist the way he had that last night in his office. But Zara jerked away from him with such force that several people turned to stare. "Don't," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than any scream. "Don't touch me. Don't speak to me. Don't pretend you have any right to know anything about my life. You made your choice 4 years ago when you handed me that money and threatened my family. I made mine when I decided we deserved better than your cruelty. Zara, please, Chris started, but she was already walking away, already gathering her daughter and the nanny, already disappearing through an exit that led to the parking garage. He stood frozen in that corridor, aware of curious eyes on him, aware that his world had just shifted on its axis in a way he couldn't begin to process. She had kept their daughter. She had vanished with his child and rebuilt herself into something powerful and untouchable. She had survived him, thrived despite him, and looking at her now was like staring at the sun after years in darkness. Chris made it back to his car before the shaking started, before the full weight of what he had lost crashed down on him with devastating clarity. He sat in the driver's seat with his hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe through the realization that somewhere in the world was a little girl who carried his features and would never know his name. Chapter 3. The Empire She Built. Chris's obsession with understanding Zara's transformation consumed him with single-minded intensity he usually reserved for hostile takeovers, except this time the target was a woman who wanted nothing from him except his permanent absence from her life. The security report arrived within days, a thick file that Chris read in his office with the door locked and his phone silenced. Each page revealing another layer of the extraordinary rebuild Zara had accomplished while he lived his hollow existence. She had disappeared completely after leaving his office that night, had used his $50,000 to book a flight under her grandmother's maiden name, had landed in a small coastal town 3 states away where nobody knew her history. The report detailed her pregnancy in sparse clinical terms, the birth of a daughter she named Sienna, the months of surviving on his blood money while working as a waitress in a diner where the owner didn't ask questions about her past. But 3 months after Sienna's birth, something happened that Zara couldn't have anticipated. A letter arrived at the post office box she had set up under her new identity, forwarded through a chain of legal offices that had been searching for her for nearly 6 years. The letter was from attorneys representing the estate of James Thorne, a tech billionaire who had died 4 years before Sienna was born. Thorne had abandoned Zara's mother before Zara was born, had spent his last decade drowning in guilt about the daughter he never met, and had left instructions in his will that his lawyers were to locate Zara Silver and deliver her inheritance, regardless of how long the search took. The inheritance was substantial but not overwhelming, $8 million and a 5% stake in Thorne Capital Ventures, the venture capital firm her father had founded 30 years earlier. It was enough to change her circumstances dramatically, but not enough to guarantee long-term security, especially with a baby and no family support. Most people would have taken the money and lived quietly, invested conservatively, avoided risk. But Zara had spent 6 months as Chris's executive assistant, watching him build an empire through calculated aggression and strategic vision, and she had learned more about venture capital and corporate warfare than he realized. She used 20,000 of Chris's blood money to buy business textbooks and online courses in finance and investment strategy. She studied obsessively during Sienna's nap times and late into the night after her daughter fell asleep, filling notebooks with market analyses and investment theories, teaching herself to read balance sheets and evaluate startup potential with the same intensity she had once brought to memorizing Chris's schedule and preferences. When Sienna was 8 months old, Zara had educated herself enough to recognize something the current management at her father's venture capital firm had completely missed. They were ignoring a biotech startup that had developed a revolutionary diagnostic tool for cardiac conditions, dismissing it because the 3 founders were young women without traditional pedigrees or connections to elite academic institutions. Zara saw what the old men running her father's firm couldn't see, that the technology was legitimate and potentially life-saving, that the founders were brilliant despite being systematically overlooked by traditional investors who couldn't see past their gender and youth. She used $4 million of her inheritance to buy a substantial stake in the startup, a gamble that terrified her because failure would mean she had squandered half her financial security on a single bet. The bet paid off spectacularly. Within 18 months, the biotech company was acquired by a pharmaceutical giant for $200 million. Zara's stake was suddenly worth $30 million, and she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building real capital. But money alone didn't make her powerful. What came next required something more difficult than financial risk. It required Zara to step out of hiding and claim her father's name publicly. She showed up at Thorn Capital Ventures headquarters with her ownership stake and demanded a board seat, faced down the old men who had been mismanaging her father's legacy for years and systematically exposed their failures with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of someone who had survived genuine threat. She was only 26 years old with a toddler at home and no formal business degree, but she had spent 2 years teaching herself everything they knew while also learning from their mistakes. The battle for control of Thorn Capital took another full year. Zara built coalitions with other frustrated investors, recruited brilliant analysts from overlooked backgrounds, and positioned herself not just as her father's heir, but as someone with a genuinely superior vision for the firm's future. By the time Sienna turned 3, Zara had tripled the firm's assets under management and established herself as one of the most successful venture capitalists in her sector. She made investments in startups led by founders, others dismissed, found companies solving real problems rather than chasing hype, and built a reputation for seeing potential where traditional investors saw only risk. The financial press called her a prodigy, never knowing that every successful investment was driven by the memory of being dismissed and threatened. Every hire of an overlooked founder was an act of revenge against a world that had tried to destroy her when she was most vulnerable. Chris learned all of this through his security report, learned that Zara hadn't been handed an empire, but had fought for every inch of her success against people who dismissed her and circumstances that should have broken her. Her father's inheritance gave her a starting point, but everything after that was earned through intelligence and determination and willingness to bet on herself when nobody else would. The $50,000 Chris had given her to solve his problem had become seed capital for her education and her first major investment, the foundation stone of an empire that now dwarfed his own achievements. But what devastated Chris more than Zara's financial success was learning about the cost of that success. The security report included details showing that Zara had given birth alone in a small regional hospital, had worked through pregnancy complications without support, had spent Sienna's first year operating on 3 hours of sleep per night while building her investment strategy. She had missed her daughter's first steps because she was in a board meeting fighting for control of her father's firm. She had hired a nanny when Sienna was 6 months old, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't afford to stop working, couldn't risk losing momentum when her entire financial security and her daughter's future depended on proving herself in a world designed to exclude people like her. The report mentioned that Zara was engaged to Owen Hartley, a pediatric surgeon with a spotless reputation and the kind of stable kindness that probably made him the exact opposite of everything Chris represented. Owen appeared in photographs throughout the file, his arm around Zara at charity events, his hand holding Sienna's as they walked through farmers' markets, his presence in their lives so natural and comfortable that it made Chris want to put his fist through his office window. The man clearly adored both Zara and Sienna, had apparently proposed after 2 years of patient courtship, and had given them the kind of peaceful family life Chris had denied them through his cowardice and cruelty. There was one photograph Chris returned to obsessively, taken at what looked like Sienna's third birthday party. Zara was laughing at something their daughter had said, her face holding genuine joy that made her look younger and more carefree than Chris had ever seen her. But if you looked closely, you could see the exhaustion around her eyes, could see the weight she carried of someone who had built something magnificent while also carrying trauma that never fully healed. She had won, but winning had required sacrifices that no person should have to make alone. Luna found him in his office late one night, still staring at photographs of Zara and Sienna on his computer screen, and something in his expression must have given away the depth of his preoccupation. She stood in the doorway wearing her silk robe, her face revealing nothing about what she was thinking. "Who is she?" Luna asked, gesturing at his screen where another image of Zara filled the display. Chris considered lying, considered protecting the fiction of their marriage a little longer, but found he lacked the energy for pretense anymore. "Someone I knew before we got married," he said, which was technically true even if it omitted every important detail. "Someone I destroyed, who rebuilt herself into something extraordinary." Luna moved into the room, her eyes scanning the papers scattered across his desk. The security report he had been too careless to hide properly. She picked up one of the photographs, studied Sienna's face with the analytical precision she applied to quarterly earnings reports, and when she looked back at Chris, her expression held a knowing that made his stomach drop. "That's your daughter," she said, not a question but a statement of fact. "You had a child with another woman and never told me." "It's complicated," Chris started, but Luna cut him off with a laugh that held absolutely no humor whatsoever. "Everything with you is complicated," she replied, setting the photograph down with exaggerated care. "I knew you were in love with someone else when we got married. I saw it in your eyes at the altar, that distance, that hollow space where real feeling should have been. But I told myself it didn't matter because we were building something bigger than romance, something that would last longer than passion. I was clearly wrong about that." Chris stood, tried to find words that might bridge the chasm that had always existed between them, but Luna held up her hand to stop him. "I don't need explanations," she said. "I need to know if you're planning to leave me for her, if you're going to blow up our arrangement because you can't stop obsessing over the woman who got away. My family's board votes keep your company stable, Chris. Without them, you're vulnerable to the takeover attempts you've been fighting off. So tell me now if you're about to do something spectacularly stupid." "She doesn't want me," Chris said, and the admission tasted like ash in his mouth. "She's moved on, built a life I have no part in. She made that very clear." "But you can't let it go," Luna observed, her tone neither sympathetic nor cruel, just clinically accurate. "You're going to keep pushing, keep investigating, keep trying to force your way into their lives until you destroy everything we've built together. I can see it happening already, the way you're distracted in meetings, the way you disappear for hours without explanation. You're becoming a liability to everything we've constructed." She was right, and they both knew it. Over the following weeks, Chris engineered situations that would put him in Zara's professional orbit, accepted speaking engagements at conferences where he knew she would be presenting, arranged business meetings with companies where her venture capital firm held major stakes. Each encounter was brief and professionally distant, Zara treating him with the polite indifference she would show any business acquaintance she barely remembered, never giving him an opening to discuss anything personal or meaningful. He watched her navigate boardrooms with lethal grace, watched her dismantle weak arguments with precise logic, watched her command respect in spaces that should have been intimidating but instead seemed almost dull compared to her overwhelming presence. What Chris didn't realize, what he couldn't see through his obsessive focus on understanding her success, was that Zara wasn't simply moving on with her life and ignoring him. She was watching him back, studying his weaknesses with the same strategic mind that had built her empire, waiting for the perfect moment to demonstrate exactly what happened to men who thought their power made them untouchable and their cruelty without lasting consequences. Chapter 4. The Truth Beneath the Surface. Chris forced the business meeting through channels that left Zara no professional way to refuse without appearing petty or unprofessional, a calculated move that felt simultaneously necessary and reprehensible given their shared history. His company needed investment backing to survive a hostile takeover attempt from a European conglomerate that smelled blood in the water. And Zara's venture capital firm controlled the kind of resources that could either save him or let him drown slowly. The irony wasn't lost on Chris that he was now begging for help from the woman he had once threatened with casual cruelty, that the power dynamics had inverted so completely that he was the one approaching hat in hand, asking for mercy from someone who had every reason to deny him. The meeting took place in a neutral conference room at a downtown hotel, the kind of sterile space designed specifically for negotiations that required no personal connection or history. Zara arrived exactly on time with 2 associates flanking her like bodyguards, their presence making it abundantly clear that this would be strictly professional with no opportunity for private conversation or emotional appeals. She wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Chris's first car had, her hair pulled back severely in a style that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, her expression revealing nothing except mild, detached interest in the financial projections his team had prepared with desperate care. She listened to his pitch with the focused attention of someone genuinely evaluating an opportunity rather than simply going through the motions. She asked pointed, intelligent questions about his company's vulnerability points, about the specific threats posed by the European takeover attempt, about his contingency plans if traditional financing fell through. And when he finished his presentation, she sat back in her leather chair and studied him with eyes that felt like they could see through every defense mechanism he had ever constructed, every lie he had ever told himself about who he was and what he deserved. "Your numbers are solid," Zara said finally, her voice carrying none of the warmth he remembered from their stolen nights together 4 years ago. "Your growth trajectory is genuinely impressive, despite the current pressure from the takeover attempt, and your market position remains defensible if properly supported. But I need to understand something before my firm commits significant resources to ensuring your survival. Why should I help you, Chris? Why should I hand you the lifeline you're desperately asking for when you spent 4 years not caring whether your daughter and I were alive or dead somewhere in the world?" The associates shifted uncomfortably at the sudden personal turn the conversation had taken, but Zara kept her eyes locked on Chris with unwavering intensity that made it impossible to look away or deflect. He had prepared extensively for tough financial questions, had rehearsed detailed responses to concerns about market volatility and competitive threats, but her directness about their shared past stripped away all his careful preparation and left him exposed. "Because this is business," he managed, hating how weak and defensive it sounded even to his own ears. "Because your firm makes money by identifying strong investments with solid fundamentals, and my company represents exactly that kind of opportunity." "Business," Zara repeated slowly, something like dark amusement flickering across her carefully controlled features. "You think you can separate what happened between us from a financial transaction? You think I can look at your balance sheets and projections without seeing you shove that envelope across your desk and tell me to fix my mistake? You really believe I've forgotten how you threatened my mother's nursing license, my brother's business contracts, everything my family had worked their entire lives to build? You think those memories just disappeared because 4 years have passed?" Chris felt his associates tense beside him, felt their confusion become palpable as pieces of a story they had never heard began clicking into uncomfortable place around them. He should have come to this meeting alone, should have anticipated that Zara would use this opportunity to expose his past in front of witnesses who could never unknow what they were learning. But he had underestimated her willingness to reveal their history publicly. "That was 4 years ago," he said quietly, desperately. "I was a different person then, operating from fear and selfishness. I made choices I deeply regret. Choices that haunt me every single day." "Regret is easy," Zara countered, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping to something more intimate and therefore more cutting. "Regret costs you absolutely nothing, Chris. It's just a feeling you experience privately while the people you hurt continue dealing with the actual consequences of your choices. But you know what was hard? Leaving the only city I'd ever known while pregnant and terrified, watching my bank account drain to nothing while I tried to figure out how to survive on your blood money, wondering every single day if you would follow through on your threats and destroy my family just because you could. You know what required actual strength? Waking up in a hospital bed after your fiancé's brother broke into my apartment and physically assaulted me to make sure I understood the seriousness of your family's intentions, realizing in that moment that keeping my daughter meant accepting I could never come back here, could never see my own family again, could never build the life I had carefully planned for myself." The words hit Chris like physical blows, each revelation cracking open his understanding of what had actually happened that night Zara disappeared from his life. He had assumed she left willingly, had taken his money and solved the problem exactly as he demanded, had moved on with her life in whatever way seemed best to her at the time. The possibility that Luna's family had actively and violently hurt her, that she had been hospitalized with injuries sustained while trying to protect his child, that she had suffered physical trauma on top of the emotional cruelty he had inflicted, made nausea rise sharp and acidic in his throat. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What actually happened to you that night?" Zara's smile held no warmth whatsoever, only the bitter acknowledgement of how little he actually knew about the consequences of his own choices. "The night I left your office with your money, I went directly home and started packing to disappear exactly as you demanded. I was planning to leave quietly, to spare my family from your threatened retaliation, to solve your problem permanently by simply ceasing to exist in your world. But Luna's brother Dominic showed up at my apartment before I could finish packing. He had a very different message about how complications should be handled, about how my continued existence represented a threat to years of careful planning by his family. He made it abundantly clear that your wedding couldn't have any problems or scandals, that I was a problem requiring permanent resolution rather than temporary management. When I tried to run from him, when I tried to lock myself in my bedroom and call for help, he made absolutely sure I understood just how serious his family was about protecting their investment in your future." Chris felt the room tilt sideways, felt every carefully constructed justification for his past behavior crumble into worthless dust. He had told himself that giving Zara money was actually generous under the circumstances, that threatening her family was simply protecting legitimate business interests, that she had made her own choices about what happened afterward, and he bore no responsibility for those choices. But hearing now that Luna's family had escalated his emotional cruelty into actual physical violence, that Zara had been attacked and injured because of the situation he created, made him confront for the first time the full scope of damage his cowardice had caused. "I didn't know," he said, aware of how utterly inadequate the words were. "I never told anyone to hurt you physically. I never wanted that kind of violence." "But you created all the conditions where it could happen," Zara replied, her voice remaining steady despite the pain clearly underlying each carefully chosen word. "You threatened my family directly. You made it absolutely clear that I had to disappear from your life immediately. You painted me as an obstacle that needed eliminating before your wedding could proceed smoothly. What exactly did you think would happen, Chris? Did you imagine I'd just take your money and vanish peacefully into the night with no complications? Did you consider for even a single moment that your powerful fiancé's family might take additional steps to protect their massive investment in your career and their carefully constructed dynastic plans? She stood abruptly, her associates rising smoothly with her in practice synchronization. The meeting clearly over, despite all the financial projections and supporting documents still lying completely untouched on the expensive conference table between them. I'm not going to invest in your company, Chris. I'm not going to save you from the natural consequences of building your entire empire on the backs of people you hurt without thinking twice. You want to survive this takeover attempt? Figure it out exactly the way I figured out how to survive you and your family's violence. Without help, without safety nets, without anyone caring even slightly whether you make it through to the other side or not. Chris rose as well, his entire body tense with the overwhelming need to stop her from leaving, to somehow fix what he had irrevocably broken, even though he knew on every level it was completely impossible. Zara, please, just listen for one moment. Let me make this right somehow. Let me do something meaningful to help you and Sienna now. Money, resources, connections, anything you might possibly need from me. We don't need anything from you, Zara said, gathering her materials with brutally efficient movements. I have more money than you'll ever manage to accumulate in your entire lifetime. I have a life you can't touch, a daughter you'll never know, a future that has absolutely no space whatsoever for your regrets or your belated attempts at redemption. The only thing you can possibly give me at this point is your complete and permanent absence from our lives. Stay away from us. Stop investigating my life through your security teams. Stop showing up at conferences and forcing these meetings. Accept that you destroyed something genuinely irreplaceable and move on with whatever remains of your life. She walked toward the door, and Chris found himself following, despite knowing he had absolutely no right to pursue her further. Just tell me why, he said, desperation making his voice crack. Tell me why you kept her when you had every possible reason to do exactly what I demanded. Tell me why you didn't come back here once you had your father's inheritance and the resources to fight me. Help me understand what happened to you. Zara turned in the doorway, and for just a single moment, her carefully maintained mask slipped just enough to show the bone-deep exhaustion that lived beneath all her magnificent success. I kept her because the moment the doctors told me I was pregnant, I loved her more intensely than I've ever loved anything or anyone in my entire life. I kept her because she deserved to exist regardless of how she was conceived or what her father wanted. I kept her because even at my absolute lowest point, lying in that hospital bed alone and terrified, I knew with complete certainty that she would be worth every single sacrifice I would have to make. And I didn't come back here because you taught me the most important lesson I've ever learned, Chris. You taught me that some people genuinely don't deserve forgiveness, no matter how much time passes or how much they claim to have changed. You taught me that some bridges should stay burned forever. She left then, her associates following in her wake like a protective detail, leaving Chris standing completely alone in that sterile conference room with the ruins of his desperate pitch scattered across expensive furniture that suddenly seemed meaningless. His own team filed out silently, their expressions carefully neutral, but their judgment obvious in the physical space they left between themselves and their employer as they departed. Chris sank back into his chair and stared at the closed door for a long time, trying unsuccessfully to process the revelation that his past was so much worse than he had ever allowed himself to remember or acknowledge. That evening, Chris drove to the hospital where Zara said she had woken after Dominic's attack, used his remaining connections to access medical records that confirmed every single devastating detail of her story with clinical precision. The emergency room intake form described a young woman found unconscious in her apartment by a neighbor who heard furniture breaking and someone screaming, documented significant head trauma and defensive wounds consistent with physical assault, noted that she was 12 weeks pregnant and terrified when she finally regained consciousness hours later. The treating physician's notes mentioned her adamant refusal to identify her attacker, her insistence that she had simply fallen clumsily on her own, her discharge against explicit medical advice early the following morning before anyone could ask more questions. Reading those clinical descriptions of Zara's pain, seeing the documented evidence of violence he had indirectly but undeniably caused through his cruelty and cowardice, made Chris understand for the first time that he wasn't the protagonist in this story, trying desperately to make amends for past mistakes. He was the villain, pure and simple, and villains didn't get redemption or happy endings just because they finally recognized the full scope of their crimes after years of willful ignorance. He sat in his car in that hospital parking lot as darkness fell around him and called Luna for the first time in weeks, needing desperately to know if she had been aware of her family's violent actions against Zara, needing to understand exactly how deep the conspiracy against an innocent pregnant woman had actually gone. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the artificial brightness of someone attending a social event. And when Chris asked her directly about her brother's involvement in Zara's disappearance and injury, the silence that followed told him absolutely everything he needed to know before she spoke a single word. "We were protecting our investment," Luna said finally, all pretense of warmth or affection evaporating completely from her tone. "You think I didn't know about your pathetic secretary? Please, Chris, give me some credit for basic intelligence. I've known about your affair since the second month it started. I had you followed professionally, documented comprehensively, analyzed thoroughly. I knew about every hotel room, every late night at the office, every lie you told to sneak away and play house with her. But I didn't care at all because you were still useful to me and my family. We needed your company, needed your reputation, needed the board seats our marriage would secure. Your heart and your fidelity were never part of our transaction." "Your brother assaulted a pregnant woman," Chris said, his voice shaking with rage he hadn't known he still possessed. "He broke into her apartment and hurt her badly enough that she woke up in a hospital with head trauma and defensive wounds. That's not protecting an investment, Luna. That's violence against an innocent person." "He ensured a complication was handled efficiently," Luna corrected, her tone suggesting she was discussing routine pest control rather than violence against a human being. "Dominic has always been exceptionally efficient at protecting our family's interests and investments." The girl clearly survived the encounter, clearly went on to thrive spectacularly given her current success. "So I genuinely fail to see why you're suddenly developing this inconvenient conscience about something that happened 4 years ago. You wanted her gone from your life badly enough to threaten her family with financial destruction, Chris. Don't pretend now that you're horrified my family made absolutely sure she stayed gone permanently." Chris felt something fundamental shift inside him, the last threads of his carefully maintained denial finally snapping under the unbearable weight of truth he could no longer avoid. His marriage wasn't just loveless and transactional. It was built on violence and cruelty that he had enabled through his own cowardice and selfishness. His company wasn't a testament to his business acumen, but rather concrete evidence of exactly how far he would go to avoid taking responsibility for his own choices and their consequences. "I want a divorce," he told Luna, the words emerging with a clarity and certainty he hadn't felt in years. "I want out of this marriage, out of this arrangement with your family, out of absolutely everything we've built together. I don't care what it costs me." Luna's laugh was sharp and cutting, the sound of someone who had anticipated this exact moment and prepared accordingly for every possible outcome. "You'll care very much when my family pulls their board votes and your company collapses within weeks. You'll care when the European takeover goes through unopposed and you lose everything you've worked for. But sure, Chris, let's get divorced. Let's blow up your entire life because you can't stop obsessing over the woman who wants absolutely nothing to do with you anymore. I'll have my lawyers draw up papers immediately, and we'll see how much your regret is actually worth." She hung up before he could respond, leaving Chris sitting alone in darkness, with only the distant glow of the hospital entrance to break the oppressive shadows closing in around him. He understood with devastating clarity that the destruction of everything he had built was only beginning, that Zara's refusal to save his company was just the opening move in a much longer game she had been planning for years. She hadn't survived him and built her empire only to let him continue thriving comfortably on the same foundations that had nearly destroyed her. She was going to systematically dismantle everything he had built, piece by careful piece, and unlike 4 years ago when she had no power whatsoever to fight back against his cruelty, this time she held all the cards, while he stood completely defenseless against the consequences of his own actions. Chapter 5. Watching everything burn. Luna filed for divorce with the same ruthless efficiency she applied to hostile business negotiations, her lawyers moving with such speed that Chris barely had time to hire adequate legal representation before the first devastating wave of destruction hit his carefully constructed life. The papers arrived at his office on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a process server who seemed almost apologetic about the sheer thickness of the legal documents he placed directly into Chris's shaking hands. Reading through the filing felt like watching a surgeon methodically catalogue every wound before beginning a brutal amputation, each clause precisely designed to cause maximum financial and emotional damage while maintaining perfect legal defensibility that would survive any court challenge. Luna wanted absolutely everything they had built together over 4 years of marriage, wanted the penthouse and the vacation properties and the entire art collection they had assembled primarily for appearances at charity events, wanted half of assets he had brought into the marriage that should have been protected. But far more devastating than the division of physical assets was the timing Luna had chosen with obvious calculation to make her move. The divorce filing was coordinated perfectly with her family's announcement of their intention to sell their substantial board holdings in Chris's company, timed to create maximum chaos at the exact moment he was most vulnerable to the European takeover attempt that had been circling like a shark for months. It was corporate warfare executed with the precision of a military campaign, every move planned to ensure his complete destruction. The board meeting where Luna's father announced their decision happened just 3 days after the divorce papers arrived. A room full of executives who had built their entire careers on Chris's vision and leadership, suddenly looking at him like he was toxic waste, requiring careful disposal and immediate quarantine. The old man spoke with casual cruelty that suggested he was actually enjoying Chris's visible anguish, explaining with false regret that recent revelations about Chris's personal conduct and moral character made continued association untenable for their family's carefully cultivated reputation. He didn't specify exactly what revelations he meant, didn't need to, because the way several board members avoided Chris's eyes suggested that damaging stories were already circulating through carefully selected channels, edited versions of his history with Zara that painted him as a predator who had sexually harassed an innocent young employee and then abandoned her when she became pregnant. Chris tried desperately to fight back, presented alternative investment opportunities that could theoretically keep the company stable without Luna's family's support, but the damage had already been done with surgical precision. By the end of that catastrophic meeting, 3 more board members announced their intention to resign immediately, citing vague personal reasons that fooled absolutely nobody in the room. Within a single week, the European conglomerate had increased their takeover offer substantially, clearly sensing blood in the water and moving with the terrifying speed of predators who recognized mortally wounded prey. Chris found himself fighting an impossible war on multiple fronts simultaneously, trying to save his disintegrating marriage while defending his collapsing company, while managing a media strategy that was spiraling beyond any possibility of control. And the absolute worst part, the thing that kept him awake during the few hours he allowed himself to attempt sleep, was discovering that Zara was behind the systematic destruction of everything he had built. His security team uncovered the connections gradually, financial trails that led back to shell companies, Zara's venture capital firm controlled, through layers of legal insulation, strategic investments in his direct competitors that seemed specifically designed to steal market share and key clients, quiet meetings between Zara and several of his now former board members in the weeks before they resigned. She wasn't just refusing to help him survive the crisis, wasn't just standing aside and letting natural consequences take their course. She was actively, methodically orchestrating his downfall with the same strategic brilliance and attention to detail she had applied to building her own empire from absolutely nothing. His security chief presented documents showing that Zara's firm had quietly acquired his largest competitor 6 months earlier, had merged it with 2 other companies to create a massive entity that now controlled more total market share than Chris's company had ever achieved even at its peak. She had been planning this destruction for far longer than he realized, positioning her pieces on the board with perfect patience while he remained completely oblivious to the trap closing around him. The media coverage of his divorce made everything exponentially worse. Tabloids running increasingly unflattering photographs of Chris leaving his lawyer's offices looking haggard and desperate, while Luna appeared poised and sympathetic in carefully staged interviews that painted her as the wronged wife with dignity. She spoke eloquently about the challenges of marriage to an ambitious man who prioritized career over family, hinted delicately at betrayals she was too classy to detail publicly, allowed the audience to fill in the blanks with assumptions that made Chris look like a cheating villain who had destroyed his own life through selfishness and poor judgment. His company's stock plummeted as shareholders lost confidence in his leadership, the takeover offer becoming more aggressive as the European conglomerate sensed that total victory was now inevitable. Chris spent every waking hour in emergency meetings with lawyers and financial advisors, all of them telling him variations of the same message that his position was completely untenable, that he needed to accept the takeover offer and salvage whatever he could from the smoking wreckage. But accepting defeat meant acknowledging that Zara had won absolutely, that she had taken his cruelty and transformed it into a weapon that destroyed everything he valued. He started drinking more than he should, stopped showing up to meetings or arrived completely unprepared, started making increasingly desperate decisions driven by panic rather than strategy. His assistant quit after he snapped at her viciously over a minor scheduling error. His remaining executives began very obviously updating their resumes on company time, and the office took on the hollow feeling of a place where people showed up only to witness a slow-motion collapse they were powerless to prevent. The takeover proceeded inexorably toward completion, his board voting to accept the European conglomerate's final offer after the last remaining investors pulled their support. Chris was offered a face-saving consulting position in the merged company, a token gesture everyone understood was really just a way to ease him out slowly while maintaining minimal legal liability. On his last day as CEO of the company he had built from nothing, he cleaned out his office completely alone after everyone else had already left for the day, packing awards and photographs that now felt like evidence of a person he used to be before everything fell apart. He left his company badge on the reception desk where security would find it in the morning and walked out into the parking garage where Zara had vanished from his life that first terrible night, understanding that he had now vanished from his own life in ways that felt permanent and deserved. The destruction was complete, total, and he had no one to blame except the man staring back at him from his car's rearview mirror. Chapter 6. Crossing the Line. Chris hit absolute bottom on an ordinary afternoon when desperation finally overwhelmed whatever remained of his self-respect, and he found himself standing outside Sienna's preschool, watching parents collect their children, while he waited for a glimpse of the daughter who didn't know he existed. He had sworn to himself he wouldn't do this, had told himself repeatedly that respecting Zara's clearly stated boundaries meant accepting permanent distance from Sienna, but 6 months of losing absolutely everything had eroded his ability to maintain even basic ethical standards or common decency. The security report had included the school's address among its comprehensive details, and Chris had memorized that information like a drowning man clinging to a lifeline. So he parked across the street in a car he had specifically rented so Zara wouldn't recognize his vehicle, and he waited with the patience of someone who had run out of any productive ways to use his time. The children emerged in small groups, their backpacks comically too large for their small bodies, their voices carrying across the afternoon air with the unself-conscious joy of people who had never learned to guard their happiness or measure their words. Chris watched them desperately, trying to identify which one was Sienna, trying to spot her distinctive features in the crowd of unfamiliar faces. Then he saw her, walking hand in hand with a woman he didn't recognize, her dark curls catching the sunlight in ways that reminded him painfully of Zara, her small face animated as she talked enthusiastically about something that apparently required elaborate hand gestures to properly explain. She was wearing a yellow dress with small flowers embroidered on the hem, her legs in striped tights that ended in sneakers that lit up when she walked, and seeing her in motion rather than frozen in photographs made Chris understand viscerally exactly what he had lost through his own cruelty and cowardice. This was his daughter, the child he had told Zara to abort, the person whose very existence he had treated as an inconvenient problem requiring immediate elimination. She was real and solid and completely unaware that her father was watching her from across the street like a predator, and the shame of his presence in this moment felt overwhelming enough that Chris almost started his rental car and drove away before she could possibly notice him. But then Sienna looked up at something the woman said, and her laugh carried clearly across the distance between them, a sound so pure and completely unguarded it struck him directly in the chest, like a physical blow. He wanted desperately to run across the street, wanted to drop to his knees in front of her and explain exactly who he was, wanted to hear her call him some variation of father that would somehow prove he wasn't completely irredeemable despite all evidence to the contrary. Instead, he sat frozen behind his steering wheel while Sienna climbed into a car that drove away, taking her laughter and her yellow dress and her complete obliviousness back to whatever safe home Zara had managed to build for them. Chris returned the next day and the day after that, establishing a pattern he knew perfectly well was surveillance bordering on stalking, but somehow couldn't force himself to stop. He learned Sienna's entire schedule through careful observation, knew she had dance class on Tuesday afternoons, knew she sometimes stayed late for extended care when Zara had evening meetings, knew the names of several of her friends from listening to other parents call them during pickup. He never approached, never tried to make any kind of contact, just watched from his rented car and collected small pieces of her life like a desperate thief stealing scraps. The pattern finally broke on an afternoon when the woman who usually picked up Sienna didn't appear on schedule, and Chris watched his daughter wait alone on the school steps, while teachers made increasingly worried phone calls and the number of remaining children dwindled to just her. He could see her trying so hard to be brave, could see the way her small shoulders stayed perfectly straight even as her eyes kept scanning the parking lot desperately for someone familiar. After 20 long minutes of watching Sienna wait there alone, Chris found himself getting out of his car and crossing the street before his conscious mind could override the overwhelming instinct to help his frightened daughter. The teacher looked up warily as he approached, her body language immediately shifting into protective mode as she assessed this unfamiliar man walking purposefully toward her remaining student. Chris stopped several careful feet away, keeping his voice gentle and his hands clearly visible, trying to project calm competence rather than the desperation actually consuming him. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said quietly. "I couldn't help noticing that little girl has been waiting quite a while. Is everything all right?" "Her regular pickup was delayed due to an emergency," the teacher said carefully, her tone making it absolutely clear she wasn't about to share any additional details with a complete stranger. "We've contacted her mother and all backup emergency contacts. Someone will definitely be here very shortly." Chris nodded, started to walk away and return to his surveillance position, but then Sienna looked directly at him, and something in her face stopped him completely cold. She wasn't crying, but he could see tears threatening, could see the enormous effort it was taking her to maintain her composure, and he found himself crouching down to her level despite the teacher's obvious and increasing discomfort with his proximity. "Hey there," he said softly. "I know waiting is really hard, but I bet your mom is on her way right now, probably going as fast as safely possible to get to you." "My nanny got sick," Sienna said, her small voice carrying a tremor she was clearly trying hard to suppress. "Mama is in a meeting that can't be interrupted. I'm supposed to be patient, but I don't like being the last one here." "Being patient is tough," Chris agreed, maintaining the careful distance the teacher's body language was demanding. "But you're doing a really excellent job of it. Not everyone can wait this calmly when they're worried. That takes genuine strength." Sienna studied him with an intensity that reminded Chris so much of Zara, his chest physically constricted. "Do you have kids?" "No," Chris said, the lie tasting bitter but necessary. "But I was a kid once, and I remember waiting for my mom feeling like the longest time in the entire world." Before Sienna could respond, a car screeched violently into the parking lot, and Zara emerged, looking panicked and disheveled in a way Chris had never seen her. She ran toward the school steps with complete disregard for her expensive heels or the professional image she usually maintained so carefully, and when she saw Chris crouched near her daughter, every single muscle in her body went rigid. Her eyes locked onto his with an expression that combined pure fury and primal terror, and Chris straightened slowly while backing away with his hands raised in obvious surrender. "I was just leaving," he said quickly, but Zara wasn't listening to his explanations, was already moving past him to gather Sienna into her arms with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had faced their worst nightmare. "Are you okay?" Zara asked Sienna, running her hands over her as if checking for any possible injuries. "Did he touch you at all? Did he say anything that made you uncomfortable?" "He was nice," Sienna said, confused by her mother's intensity. "He told me I was being patient while I waited for you. Why are you so scared, Mama?" Zara's eyes never left Chris's face, her expression promising consequences he couldn't begin to imagine. She signed something to the teacher, thanked her with forced politeness, then guided Sienna toward her car while keeping her body positioned protectively between her daughter and Chris. He stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching them leave, understanding with absolute certainty that he had just crossed a line that would have permanent and serious ramifications. His phone rang less than an hour later, an unfamiliar number that turned out to be Zara's lawyer. The attorney's voice was professional but absolutely firm, explaining that a temporary restraining order was being filed immediately and that a formal hearing would be scheduled within 2 weeks to determine if it should become permanent. Any further contact whatsoever with Sienna or proximity to any locations she frequented would result in immediate legal action and possible criminal charges for stalking and harassment. The lawyer emphasized clearly that this was a protective measure rather than punitive, and that Chris could certainly contest it in court if he chose, though doing so would require explaining to a judge why he had been systematically surveilling his daughter's preschool. Chris hung up without trying to defend himself. Without attempting to explain, he had only been trying to help when he saw Sienna waiting alone, because there was simply no explanation that would justify his behavior. He had been stalking his daughter, surveilling her school, inserting himself into her life without any permission or right whatsoever. The fact that he hadn't meant any harm didn't negate the fundamental violation involved. He was exactly the kind of dangerous person parents warned their children about, and the restraining order was entirely appropriate protection against the genuine threat he represented. The next weeks passed in a haze of self-destruction that even Chris recognized as dangerous but completely lacked the will or energy to prevent. He drank far too much and slept far too little, stopped returning calls from the few friends who still bothered checking on him, let his consulting position lapse entirely when he repeatedly failed to show up for scheduled meetings. His bank account dwindled steadily as he burned through the limited assets Luna had left him after the divorce, paying for an apartment he barely inhabited and meals he rarely remembered eating. Chris's brother called from across the country, where he had built a stable life completely untouched by Chris's implosion. They talked for nearly 2 hours, and Chris found himself confessing absolutely everything to someone who had known him before all of this happened. His brother listened without judgment, asked gentle questions, and when Chris finally finished, suggested that maybe it was time to seriously consider whether staying in the same city as the family he had destroyed was actually helping anyone, or just prolonging an agony that served no constructive purpose whatsoever. "You can't fix what you broke," his brother said with the bluntness of someone who loved him enough to tell uncomfortable truths. "And every single day you stay there, every time you drive past places connected to them, you're just picking at wounds that desperately need to scar over. Maybe you need to leave, Chris. Maybe you need to accept that your presence in their city is punishment for them, rather than penance for you." The words lodged in Chris's chest like shrapnel, painful but accurate in ways he couldn't deny or rationalize away. He had convinced himself that suffering in proximity to Zara and Sienna was appropriate punishment for his crimes, but really, he was just making himself a constant threat they had to guard against, a shadow preventing them from feeling truly safe. Leaving would be the first genuinely selfless thing he had done in years, choosing their peace over his desperate need to be near them. Chris started making concrete plans to relocate, contacted headhunters about opportunities in other cities, began the painful process of dismantling his life in the place where both his greatest successes and most devastating failures had occurred. It felt simultaneously like cowardly escape and genuine accountability, running away from consequences while also removing himself as an ongoing source of harm and fear. On his last night in the city, Chris drove past Zara's building one final time, not stopping or even slowing down, just acknowledging that this was the physical space where his daughter lived and grew and existed without him. He whispered something that might have been goodbye or apology toward the illuminated windows, then continued driving until the building disappeared completely from his rearview mirror. The next morning, he packed his car with the few possessions that still mattered and started driving east toward a city where nobody knew his history, where he could be anonymous and irrelevant and no longer a danger to the people he had failed most catastrophically. The restraining order would follow him as a permanent record of his worst impulses, and the memory of Sienna's face when she saw him outside her school would haunt him forever. But at least he wouldn't be stalking a preschool parking lot anymore, wouldn't be forcing Zara to constantly look over her shoulder, wouldn't be inflicting his presence on a family that deserved peace after surviving him. It wasn't redemption, barely even qualified as basic human decency, but it was the only thing Chris had left to offer. Chapter 7. Letting Go. Zara stood in her corner office overlooking the city she had conquered, holding a contract that represented the final phase of her carefully orchestrated revenge. and felt absolutely nothing except hollow recognition that victory had cost her more than Chris's cruelty ever had. The hostile takeover of Chris's remaining company holdings sat on her desk awaiting her signature, the culmination of 2 full years of strategic planning and ruthless execution. Her lawyers had structured it absolutely perfectly, a shell corporation that would acquire his last minority stake for pennies on the dollar, eliminating his final financial connection to the empire he had once controlled. It was comprehensive and devastating, the kind of business maneuver that would leave him with nothing except painful memories of what he had lost. Zara picked up her pen, positioned it carefully above the signature line, and found her hand completely refusing to complete the motion. Her assistant knocked softly before entering, carrying the afternoon's messages and wearing a concerned expression she had learned to mask poorly over recent months. "The legal team is waiting for your authorization. They need your signature to proceed with the acquisition before close of business today. If we miss this window, Chris's creditors might get there first." "Let them," Zara heard herself say, setting down the pen with finality. "Call legal and tell them we're withdrawing the offer entirely." The assistant's surprise was visible, but quickly controlled, her professionalism preventing her from questioning the decision that contradicted months of meticulous planning. She left to make the necessary calls, while Zara stood at her windows, watching traffic flow through streets far below, tiny cars carrying people toward lives that probably made more sense than hers did at the moment. She had spent so much energy on revenge, had devoted countless hours to dismantling Chris's empire piece by systematic piece, had found genuine satisfaction in each quarterly report showing her gains and his losses. But somehow, during her campaign to destroy him, she had lost sight of why she wanted destruction in the first place. The truth Zara had been avoiding for months was that revenge hadn't healed anything. Chris losing his company didn't undo the night Dominic had assaulted her, didn't erase the years she had spent hiding, didn't give Sienna a father or Zara back the version of herself who had believed in love before learning its cost. She had won every battle and somehow still felt like she was losing the war, her victories hollow because they were measured against someone else's destruction rather than her own reconstruction. Her phone rang with a call she had been expecting but dreading, Owen's name appearing with the inevitability of consequences she had been postponing. They had been engaged for a year, should have been married by now if Zara hadn't kept finding reasons to delay setting a date. He was patient and kind and everything she should have wanted, but lately, even thinking about their future felt exhausting in ways she couldn't explain. She answered on the 3rd ring, trying to inject warmth into her voice that didn't quite reach her actual emotional state. "I got the job offer," Owen said without preamble, his tone carrying excitement she knew she was supposed to share. "Director of Pediatric Surgery at the Children's Hospital. It's everything I've been working toward, Zara. The only complication is that it's on the other side of the country, and they need an answer within 2 weeks." Zara felt something crack inside her chest, a clean break that had been forming over months of recognizing their fundamental incompatibility. She loved Owen in the way someone loves a person who had helped them survive difficult times, but she wasn't in love with him, had never felt the consuming passion she once experienced with Chris before it curdled into trauma. Owen deserved someone who would be excited about following him across the country, who would celebrate his success without thinking about corporate acquisitions and revenge campaigns. "That's wonderful news," Zara said carefully. "You should absolutely take it. This is the opportunity you've been preparing for your entire career." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Zara knew Owen had heard what she wasn't saying, had recognized the careful distance in her response. When he spoke again, his voice carried resignation mixed with something that might have been relief. "But you're not coming with me. You're not even going to consider it." "I can't leave the life I've built here," Zara said, which was true, but not complete. The fuller truth was that she didn't want to leave, that her entire identity had become entangled with proving she could succeed in the city that had tried to destroy her. Moving would feel like retreat, like admitting Chris had been powerful enough to drive her away even in his defeat. "And I don't think I'm the partner you need, Owen. You deserve someone who can match your excitement, who doesn't spend every night thinking about corporate strategy instead of wedding planning." They talked for another hour, Owen's voice cycling through hurt and understanding and eventual acceptance. He had known for months their relationship was deteriorating, had noticed her emotional absence even when she was physically present. When they finally said goodbye, Owen's last words were a hope that she would eventually find a way to heal that didn't require destroying anyone, including herself. Zara sat in her office after the call ended, the unsigned takeover contract still sitting on her desk like evidence of how far she had strayed from the person she wanted to be. She thought about Sienna coming home from school, talking about her day, about how her daughter's laughter had become less frequent as Zara spent more evenings working late, about the way Sienna had started asking questions about why Mama seemed sad even when she was smiling. Somewhere in her campaign against Chris, Zara had lost sight of the fact that the best revenge would have been building a joyful life he couldn't touch, rather than dedicating years to ensuring his misery. She picked up the contract and fed it into her shredder, watching the paper transform into ribbons that represented months of planning destroyed in seconds. Then she called her lawyers and instructed them to withdraw from all pending actions against Chris's remaining holdings, told them to cease monitoring his activities, informed them that her vendetta was officially over, regardless of whether justice had been adequately served. That evening, Zara left work early for the first time in months and picked up Sienna from school herself, seeing her daughter's face light up with surprised joy. They went to the park instead of going straight home, Sienna chattering about her friends and her drawing class and the book her teacher had read. Zara pushed her on swings and helped her navigate the climbing structure and tried to be fully present rather than mentally reviewing business strategies. When Sienna asked if they could get ice cream for dinner, Zara said yes, even though it was against their usual rules, bought them both enormous cones that melted faster than they could eat them. They sat on a bench watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Sienna's small body pressed against Zara's side with unself-conscious affection. "Mama," Sienna said thoughtfully, ice cream dotting her chin, "are you feeling better now? You seemed sad for a long time, but today you seem like yourself again." Zara felt tears threaten at her daughter's perceptiveness, at the recognition that even 4-year-olds could sense when their parents were struggling. She wrapped her arm around Sienna and kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with vanilla ice cream. "I am feeling better. I was spending too much time thinking about things that happened a long time ago, instead of paying attention to what's happening right now, but I'm going to do better, I promise." "Good," Sienna said with satisfied finality, "because right now is the best part of the day. Right now we have ice cream and the sky is pretty and you're here. Yesterday and tomorrow don't matter as much as right now." The wisdom in her daughter's simple observation made Zara realize how much time she had wasted living in the past and planning revenge instead of appreciating the present she had built. Chris had taken enough from her without also stealing the years she could have spent fully engaged with Sienna's childhood. Later that night, after Sienna was asleep, Zara went through her files and deleted every document related to her revenge campaign, cleared her computer of surveillance reports and financial analyses tracking Chris's declining fortunes. She found the folder of photographs her security team had compiled, images of Chris looking increasingly desperate and destroyed over months of his systematic dismantling. Looking at them now made her feel sick rather than satisfied. Zara's head of security called the next morning with news that Chris had left the city, had packed up his apartment, and relocated somewhere on the East Coast. She listened to the report and then told her security chief to stop tracking Chris's movements, that she no longer needed updates on his whereabouts or activities, that his life was no longer her business. She spent the following weeks trying to rebuild her life around something other than revenge, reconnecting with friends she had neglected, taking actual vacations with Sienna, where she left her work phone at home, sitting with a therapist who gently pointed out that trauma required processing rather than projection onto external targets. It was harder than Zara expected to let go of the anger that had been her constant companion for years, harder to accept that Chris's suffering hadn't actually healed her wounds. But slowly, incrementally, Zara began to recognize herself again in ways that felt authentic rather than reactive. She laughed more easily, slept better, noticed flowers blooming and small beautiful things that existed regardless of corporate warfare. Sienna responded to her mother's increased presence with joy that reminded Zara of what she had been fighting to protect in the first place. And late at night, when memories of Chris threatened to pull her back into darkness, Zara reminded herself that the best revenge was the life she had already built, the daughter she loved, the empire she controlled through strength rather than bitterness. Letting him go didn't mean forgiving him, just meant acknowledging that holding on to rage hurt her more than it hurt him. Chapter 8. The emergency Sienna collapsed during her dance recital on an ordinary afternoon, her small body crumpling mid-pirouette, while Zara watched from the audience with her heart stopping before her mind could process what was happening. The ambulance arrived within minutes, paramedics moving with practiced efficiency, while Zara tried to hold herself together as they stabilized her daughter and asked questions about medical history that suddenly seemed catastrophically incomplete. She knew Sienna's pediatrician and vaccination schedule, but when they started asking about family genetic conditions and hereditary disorders, Zara realized with sickening clarity that she only knew half of her daughter's medical story. They admitted Sienna to the pediatric intensive care unit, her small form dwarfed by machines monitoring every vital sign. The attending physician was kind but direct, explaining that Sienna's collapse suggested a cardiac abnormality requiring immediate investigation, that they needed comprehensive family medical histories from both parents to properly assess genetic risk factors. Zara sat beside her sleeping daughter and made a list of her own family's medical information while confronting the unavoidable reality that she needed to contact Chris. Her hands shook as she called her lawyer, explained the medical emergency, and asked for guidance. The lawyer was professionally sympathetic, immediately filing an emergency motion to temporarily suspend the restraining order for medical purposes only, the kind of modification judges routinely granted when a child's health was at stake. The suspension would be limited to medical communications and hospital visits related to Sienna's condition. But Zara needed the information immediately rather than waiting for the judge's signature. She had deleted all her files on Chris's whereabouts, had instructed her security team to stop surveillance, had no idea how to reach him. The irony wasn't lost on Zara that she had spent enormous resources tracking his every movement during her revenge campaign, and now, when she actually needed him for their daughter's well-being, she had no way to make contact. She finally called his brother, whose number she still had. The conversation was awkward and brief, Zara explaining the medical emergency and begging for Chris's current contact information. The brother provided a phone number with the warning that Chris had been through hell and didn't need further devastation. Zara stared at the number for a full minute before finding the courage to dial. When the line connected and she heard Chris's cautious hello, every prepared speech evaporated. It's Sienna. She collapsed during dance class. She's in pediatric intensive care, and the doctors need your complete medical history immediately. Can you help us?" The silence stretched long enough that Zara thought the call might have dropped, but then she heard Chris's sharp intake of breath. "Is she okay? What happened? What hospital are you at?" Zara provided the clinical details, the cardiac abnormality and genetic testing, and immediate need for his family's medical information. She heard Chris moving, heard him say he was leaving his office right now and would be on the next available flight. "Send me your email. I'll have my doctor forward my complete medical file within the hour. And Zara, I'm not trying to intrude. I just want to help. I'll stay away from you and Sienna if that's what you need, but please let me provide whatever information the doctors require." "The restraining order doesn't matter right now," Zara said. "Sienna needs help, and you're her father, regardless of our history. Just get the medical records to the hospital as fast as possible." She provided her email and the hospital's contact information, then returned to Sienna's bedside where her daughter had woken up, looking scared and confused. Zara held her hand and explained that the doctors were running tests to make sure her heart was working properly. Chris's medical records arrived electronically within 40 minutes, a comprehensive file that documented his family's history of cardiac conditions, including the sudden death of his grandfather from an undiagnosed heart defect. The attending physician reviewed the information with visible relief, explaining that knowing the genetic pattern helped them identify Sienna's specific condition and develop an appropriate treatment plan. The diagnosis was a congenital heart defect that would require surgery, but it was treatable if addressed promptly. Zara texted him an update about the diagnosis and planned surgery, keeping her message clinical. Instead of a simple acknowledgement, her phone rang immediately. "I'm at the airport," Chris said without preamble. "My flight board's in 20 minutes. I know I don't have the right to be there, but I found the top pediatric cardiac surgeon in the country, Dr. Amelia Reeves. She's consulting in Boston, but she's willing to fly out tomorrow to evaluate Sienna if you authorize it. She pioneered the specific surgical technique your daughter needs." Zara felt something shift in her understanding of who Chris had become. "How did you even find her?" "I called everyone I used to know with medical connections. I explained the situation and asked who was the absolute best regardless of cost. Dr. Reeves's name came up 3 times. "Okay," Zara said, too tired to maintain walls. "Have her assistant contact the hospital directly. And Chris, thank you. For the medical records and the specialist. That matters." She heard his breath catch. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I'll stay in the hospital waiting room once I arrive. I won't approach Sienna unless you give permission. I just need to be nearby in case the doctors have questions." Zara agreed, gave him hospital details, then returned to Sienna's bedside. Chris arrived 6 hours later, and Zara knew the moment he entered because her phone buzzed with a text saying he was in the waiting room. Sometime around midnight, she found herself walking down to where Chris sat alone in a corner, his head in his hands. They stared at each other across the sterile waiting room, and all the practiced speeches evaporated in the face of shared terror for their daughter. "She's stable," Zara said quietly. "The surgical team is preparing for the operation in 2 days." Chris stood, but made no move to approach. "Is there anything I can do?" "You already helped," Zara replied. "The specialist you found is consulting on Sienna's case. Your medical records gave them critical information. You've done everything a father could do." The word father hung between them. Chris's eyes filled with tears. "Can I see her? Just for a minute. I won't wake her." Zara should have said no. But standing in that waiting room watching Chris barely hold himself together, she couldn't deny him this small thing. 5 minutes, but if she wakes up, you leave immediately." She led him to the pediatric intensive care unit, signed him in as immediate family, then stood by the door while Chris approached Sienna's bedside with cautious reverence. He looked at their daughter for a long moment, taking in her small face and the machines tracking her vital signs. When the 5 minutes ended, Chris thanked Zara with his eyes and left without protest. She found him in the hallway afterward, his back against the wall. "She's so small," he said. "So fragile and perfect. How do you survive the fear of loving someone that much?" "You learn to live with terror," Zara said, surprising herself by engaging. "You learn that loving someone means being perpetually vulnerable. And you accept that risk because the alternative is worse." They stood together in that hospital corridor, two people bound by a daughter and separated by history too painful to simply forget. And for the first time since Zara had walked away from Chris's office 4 years ago, they were simply two terrified parents. Chapter 9. Rebuilding Trust. Sienna's surgery lasted 7 hours, and Chris never left the surgical waiting room despite Zara telling him repeatedly that he didn't need to stay. But Chris remained in that uncomfortable chair, his presence becoming a quiet constant that Zara found simultaneously comforting and unsettling. Her mother arrived mid-morning, embracing Zara with powerful protectiveness. She looked at Chris with undisguised suspicion and positioned herself between him and Zara like a barrier against harm. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here," her mother said, her voice low but sharp. "After what you did, you think you have the right to be here now?" Chris looked up with eyes holding no defensiveness. "I don't have the right to be anywhere near Zara or Sienna. I'm only here because Sienna needed my medical records. If you want me to leave, I will." Zara's mother studied him with the assessing gaze of someone who had spent years reading honesty in faces. Whatever she saw made her expression soften slightly. She turned to Zara, touched her daughter's face gently, and whispered that she would get coffee. When she returned with 3 cups instead of 2, she silently handed one to Chris. They waited together in tense silence. Chris made himself useful in small ways, bringing water, asking about meal options, moving his chair away when he sensed his proximity made Zara uncomfortable. He never pushed for recognition, just existed quietly in the margins. The surgeon finally emerged in late afternoon, explaining that the procedure had gone well, that Sienna had tolerated the surgery better than expected. The defect was corrected, the repair looked stable, and their daughter should be able to live a completely normal life. Zara felt her legs go weak with relief, her mother catching her elbow. When the surgeon asked if there were questions, Chris spoke up, his voice carrying specific medical inquiries that suggested he had spent waiting hours researching pediatric cardiac surgery. "What's the long-term prognosis? Will she need follow-up surgeries? Are there activity restrictions?" The surgeon answered each question thoroughly. She directed most responses to Zara, but Chris took careful notes. They were allowed to see Sienna an hour later. She was still unconscious, her small chest rising and falling with the ventilator, and seeing her daughter so vulnerable made Zara's composure crack. She sank into the chair beside Sienna's bed and wept, her mother's arms wrapping around her while Chris stood awkwardly near the door. When Zara regained control, she looked up to find Chris still there with tears tracking down his face. He wasn't looking at her, but at Sienna. "You can come closer," she heard herself say. "You flew across the country. You might as well see her properly." Chris approached slowly, stopping on the opposite side of Sienna's bed, his hands gripping the rail. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for letting me be here." "You're her father," Zara said. "Whatever happened between us, she still carries your genetics. You had a right to know she was in danger." They stood on opposite sides of their daughter's bed, watching her breathe, two people connected by this small person. Zara's mother excused herself, giving them privacy. The silence between them felt different, more contemplative. "I left the city," Chris said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper. "After you filed the restraining order. I moved to the East Coast, took a job that pays a fraction of what I used to make, started seeing a therapist. I'm not telling you this to get credit. I just want you to know I understand how badly I failed you and Sienna. I understand that threatening you was unforgivable. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just telling you I know." Zara absorbed his words, recognizing the difference between the man who had shoved money across a desk and this broken person who had flown across the country. "I destroyed your company," she said. "I spent 2 years dismantling your empire. I wanted you to suffer. I thought revenge would heal something, but it just made me bitter and exhausted." "You had every right to destroy me," Chris replied. "I deserved that, and worse." They fell silent, watching Sienna's chest rise and fall. A nurse came to check vitals, explaining they would start weaning Sienna off the ventilator in a few hours. Over the following days, as Sienna recovered, Chris maintained his respectful distance while remaining available. He stayed at a hotel, came during visiting hours, but left promptly when asked, brought food for the nursing staff. He never tried to introduce himself to Sienna, just existed in the background as quiet support. Sienna woke fully on the 3rd day post-surgery, confused but alive. She asked questions with direct curiosity, and Zara explained that the doctors had fixed something in her heart. Sienna accepted this with resilience, more interested in cartoons. Chris was there during one of Sienna's waking periods, standing near the window, and when Sienna noticed him, she tilted her head with recognition. "You're the nice man from school," she said, "the one who said I was being patient." "That's right," Chris said carefully. "I came to check on how you're doing." "My heart was broken," Sienna agreed matter-of-factly, "but the doctors fixed it. Mama says I'll be able to dance again." "That's wonderful," Chris said, fighting to maintain composure. "I'm glad the doctors could help you. You're very brave." "I wasn't brave during the surgery," Sienna said seriously. "I was asleep. Being brave is when you're scared, but you do the thing anyway." The observation made both Chris and Zara smile. Sienna asked if Chris was a friend of her mother's, and Zara found herself answering honestly that he was someone she used to know, that he had helped when Sienna got sick. After Sienna drifted back to sleep, Chris approached Zara. "I should probably head back east soon. I just wanted to know if it would be okay to leave my contact information, not to push for involvement, but just so you can reach me if there's another medical emergency." Zara considered refusing, but found she couldn't deny that having access to his medical information might be important. "Okay, leave your information with the hospital administrators. And Chris, thank you for being here this week." His eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. The next morning, Zara found he had checked out and returned to wherever he now lived, leaving behind medical documents and a note thanking the nursing staff. Sienna's recovery progressed faster than expected. Within 2 weeks, she was home complaining about activity restrictions. Zara found herself thinking about Chris more than she expected, wondering how he was processing having met his daughter so briefly. She didn't contact him, but she kept his information in her phone, an acknowledgement that some connections couldn't be completely severed. And late at night, when Sienna was sleeping peacefully, Zara allowed herself to consider the possibility that people could change. That maybe someday there could be space for Chris to know his daughter in ways that didn't damage anyone. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet and possibly never, but it was the first softening, the first recognition that the future didn't have to be dictated entirely by the past. Chapter 10. The Beginning. The call came on an ordinary afternoon 6 months after Sienna's surgery, Chris's name appearing on Zara's phone screen for the first time since he had left the hospital with nothing but gratitude and goodbye. Zara stared at the incoming call for 3 rings before answering, her voice carefully neutral. Chris sounded nervous, his words coming slightly too fast as he apologized for calling and asked if she had a moment to talk. Sienna has been asking questions about her father, Zara heard herself say before Chris could continue. Not constantly, just the kind of age-appropriate curiosity kids develop when they notice their family structure looks different. She's asked why she doesn't have a daddy when her friends do, whether her father knows she exists. The silence stretched long enough that Zara thought she had made a mistake, but when Chris spoke, his voice carried careful consideration rather than desperate eagerness. How do you want to handle that? What feels right to you? Because I don't want to complicate your life or confuse Sienna. But if she's asking questions, I also don't want my absence to create a void that gets filled with fantasies. I don't know what the right answer is, Zara admitted. Part of me wants to protect her from the complicated truth. But another part thinks that's my damage to process, not hers. She deserves to know she has a father who exists, who knows about her. We're different, Chris repeated, past tense. Are different, Zara corrected after a long pause. Present tense, because I've been thinking about this for months. Thinking about what Sienna needs versus what I need. And I don't have good answers, but I'm starting to believe that keeping you completely out of her life forever might not be the protective choice I convinced myself it was. She heard his breath catch. What does that mean? Practically. I don't know yet, Zara said honestly. Maybe it means meeting once, somewhere neutral, so Sienna can see that her father is a real person who cares about her existence. Maybe it means occasional updates about her development. Maybe it means nothing more than me telling her the truth in age-appropriate terms. I genuinely don't know. They talked for nearly an hour. Chris asked careful questions about what Sienna was like, what made her laugh, what she struggled with. Zara found herself answering with honesty that surprised her, describing their daughter in detail. She told him about Sienna's obsession with dinosaurs, her fear of thunderstorms, the way she insisted on wearing mismatched socks because matching is boring. Chris listened with focused attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed how deeply he wanted to understand. When Zara mentioned Sienna's love of stories about dragons, Chris admitted he had been buying children's books for months, a collection he would probably never give to Sienna but couldn't stop acquiring. I know it's pathetic, building a library for a child I might never read to, but it makes me feel connected to her somehow. The admission made Zara's chest tighten with emotions she couldn't fully identify. The man who had threatened her wouldn't have bought children's books he might never use. 3 weeks after that phone call, Zara found herself sitting on a park bench with Sienna beside her, watching a man approach across the grass with careful, measured steps. She had called Chris 2 days earlier with a simple proposal. He could meet Sienna, briefly and in public, with no promises about future contact. Just an introduction. Sienna had been excited and nervous when Zara explained that morning that they were going to meet someone special, someone who had been asking about her. Zara had kept the explanation age-appropriate, saying this was a man who cared about Sienna very much but hadn't been able to be part of her life until now. She didn't use the word father, didn't want to load the encounter with expectations. Chris sat down on the bench at the other end, maintaining space, his movements careful. He looked different, less polished and more genuine. When he spoke, his voice was gentle and uncertain. Hi, Sienna. My name is Chris. It's really nice to finally meet you. Sienna studied him with frank curiosity. You were at the hospital, she said after a moment. When my heart was broken, Mama said you helped the doctors fix me. I tried to help a little bit, Chris said, his eyes already filling with tears. Mostly the doctors did all the real work. But I'm really glad they could fix your heart. Your mom tells me you're already back to dancing. I can do 12 pirouettes now without falling, Sienna announced with pride. That's more than anyone else in my class. Do you like dancing? I'm terrible at dancing, Chris admitted with a small smile. but I love watching people who are good at it." They talked for 20 minutes, their conversation meandering through topics that mattered to Sienna. Chris listened with complete attention, asked questions that showed genuine interest, never tried to claim significance. When Sienna mentioned she didn't have a father like other kids, Chris's expression flickered with pain. But Chris recovered quickly. "You do have a father," he said carefully. "Sometimes parents can't be together for complicated grown-up reasons, but that doesn't mean they don't care. Your father cares about you very much, Sienna. He thinks about you every day." "Are you my father?" Sienna asked with directness. Chris looked at Zara, his expression asking permission, and she nodded slightly. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm your father, and meeting you today is one of the best things that's ever happened to me." Sienna processed this with thoughtful silence. "Why can't you be part of my life in all the ways that matter?" "Because sometimes parents make mistakes," Chris said, his voice breaking. "Really big mistakes that hurt people they care about. And sometimes those mistakes mean they don't get to have the family they want. But that doesn't change how much I care about you, or how proud I am that you're my daughter." Zara watched Chris struggle through this explanation, watched him try to be honest without burdening Sienna with details she was too young to understand. When Sienna asked if she could see Chris again sometime, Zara found herself answering before she had fully decided. "Maybe, if your father wants to, and if we can figure out a way to do it that's good for everyone. This is complicated, and grown-ups are still figuring it out. So we're taking it one visit at a time." Sienna nodded with easy acceptance. She turned back to Chris and said with complete sincerity, "I'm glad I got to meet you. You seem nice." The observation made both Zara and Chris laugh, despite the emotional weight. When it was time to leave, Sienna waved goodbye with unself-conscious friendliness. Chris remained on that bench watching them walk away, and when Zara looked back, she saw him with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. That evening, after Sienna was asleep, Zara stood at her window, looking out at the city that had witnessed both the worst and possibly the beginning of something resembling repair. She thought about Chris sitting on that bench, thought about the way he had spoken to their daughter with such careful tenderness. Zara didn't have answers, only questions, and recognition that some wounds never fully healed, but could perhaps scar over in ways that allowed movement. Chris would never be the father Sienna deserved, would never undo the damage, would never fully earn forgiveness that Zara wasn't sure she could give. But maybe he could be something smaller and more realistic, a flawed person who had learned from catastrophic mistakes and was willing to show up with no expectations. The future was uncertain, potentially painful, definitely complicated. But standing at her window with Sienna sleeping peacefully, Zara allowed herself to believe that some bridges burned so completely that all you could do was learn to walk on ash. And if you were lucky, someone might meet you halfway, and together you might build something small and careful that honored the damage while leaving space for the possibility that tomorrow could be different than yesterday. It wasn't a happy ending, wasn't redemption or reconciliation. It was just two broken people trying to do better by a child who deserved more than their history, taking one uncertain step at a time toward a future that would always carry the weight of the past, but might somehow make space for something resembling grace.